Return statements allow us to leave our methods and give back something to whoever called our method. Now remember, if you specify your return type up here, all of the returns inside your code have to match that data type. So here we have Boolean and we have true and false. But if you had put a double or a string, you would get an error because it needs to be of type Boolean. Now, if you don't have any return statements in your method and your method is not supposed to return anything, then you should have a lowercase void here. And if you have void there, then you cannot put return statements or you will also get an error in that case. So when you return from your method, it's going to leave the method. So anytime the computer reaches a return statement, it's going to actually leave the method and not continue with the rest of the code of the method. So for example, imagine this has money in account method and all it's going to do is return true if there's money in the account and return false if there is not money in the account. So if the amount of money you have in your bank account is zero or less, then you don't have money in your bank account. Otherwise, you do have money in your bank account. So you can imagine that this could be a method in our bank account class, and it would use this amount that we saw in our bank account class to determine whether there is or isn't money in the bank account. So if the amount was greater than zero, we know we would go into this if statements code and we would return true. So what would happen here is we'd actually jump out of this method and go back to wherever it is that that method was called and give it back true, and then you can continue the code on from wherever you were that you called this method. So you would actually not get to this system.out.print statement here, and you would not print out uh-oh if you got into this and you returned true. Now, if amount had been zero or less than zero, then you would skip this code, so you wouldn't return true, you wouldn't leave the method, and you would go down to this code. So now you would print uh-oh, and then you would return false and leave the method. Now, if you forgot to put return false here, you will get an error because in Java, if you specify that the return type is Boolean, that means in every scenario of this method, there needs to be a way to return a Boolean. So Java will realize that there's no way to return a Boolean if amount is zero or less than zero if you do not have this return false here. So if you forgot to put this return false, Java's going to say, hey, wait a minute, if amount is zero or less than zero, we're going to be in a scenario where we're not going to return out of this method, and you specified that this method does have a return no matter what. So in that case, you will get an error. So make sure that you have return false and that you have return true up here. Now, if you didn't have return true up here and you just forgot to put return true, that would be fine. Your method would probably not work as you want it to because it will never return true in this case, but you won't get that same error where you're not returning because instead you would just skip this code, right? Because there wouldn't be any code in here. Well, you wouldn't skip what's in here, but you just wouldn't have the return true if you forgot it. So you would run through nothing and then you'd move on, say uh-oh, and return false. So in that case, you're still returning out of the code. But if you had forgotten to put return true and have put an else around these two lines of code, then you would get that same error, right? Because if you say if amount is greater than zero, you go into this code and you forget to put return true, so nothing happens. And then the else statement, you'd never go inside the else statement because if you have an if and an else, and the if is true, then you never go into the else. And in that case, you would run into the same issue where you're not returning. So make sure that you have a return in every scenario of your code and you should be fine. And if you get an error about the return types, then you know it's probably because you missed a return somewhere.